Hey, you're watching Just Press Record on the Cultish Creative YouTube channel. I'm your host, Matt Ziegler, and on each episode, I invite not one, but two guests to join me for a conversation-style interview. These are smart, funny, usually a little eccentric, frequently a little weird, often very online friends of mine, and even if you don't understand what they have in common at first, just wait, because I've seen some common ground between them that I've been dying to ask them about, and just press record. The show practically named itself, seriously. So subscribe, like, comment below, and stick around at the end of the disclosures, disclaimers, and reminders, and, come find me, cultishcreative.com, at cultishcreative on Twitter, and by name on LinkedIn. Without further ado, throw your seatbelts on. Let's make it a record. Okay, I am pressing record now. Hello and welcome back. You're watching Just Press Record. This is the Cultish Creative YouTube channel. Today we're talking confidence and decision making, but first, I have to introduce you to my two absolutely incredible guests here. First up, she's a fractional marketer extraordinaire. She's a TikTok superstar. My sources tell me she's a recovered or perhaps recovering child prodigy, international classical music superstar, the leader of the Kizuna community and studio, which is full of incredible people that I've come to adore. And when you think about your top graces, I'm on record already with this. She comes in above Grace Kelly. She's above Jeff Buckley's classic album, Grace. And on my list, she even edges out the amazing Grace, the song, the true amazing Grace. Great Nikae, say hello, please.
Hi, Matt. It's so wonderful to be here and to be able to chat with you again. Excited.
And joining Grace and I today, my next guest is a veteran of the financial services industry. He's a hedge fund mover and shaker, a TV talking head. That's an extra David Byrne reference because I know you love GarageBand names on Twitter. It's a Wall Street journalist, William and Mary, and University of Delaware professor, ladies and gentlemen, the cartographer of confidence himself, Mr. Peter Atwater. Say hello, sir.
Hi, Matt. Hello, Grace. Cartographer of confidence. You worked on that, I can tell.
Really, really hard. I'm not going to tell you about my procrastination streak and how long ago that was born, but I'll blurb your next book. You just tell me. All right. So I'm so happy you're here because we're going to talk the cadences of confidence and the harmony of collaboration and the rhythm making of decision with these two recovered musicians right here. So Peter, I want to start with you and I want to talk about the tool that's in your book because that's really where this conversation is coming from. Can you tell us to start? What is the confidence map? How do you explain it like to two knucklehead students that we are for you today?
Sure. Knuckleheads you are not. So I teach a class on confidence and decision-making, and about a year or so in, I discovered that I really didn't know what confidence was, which you might imagine as a professor is a rather awkward moment. But I then went down a rabbit hole to try and figure out what do we need in order to feel confident. I concluded that there were two variables that we tend to think of as a buy one, get one free, but are in fact independent. One is we need to feel certain that things ahead of us feel predictable, that we have a sense of what's coming. And at the same time, we need to have an element of control, that we need to believe that we are able to handle what's coming. So you could think about it. It's useful to know that the road is straight ahead of us. It requires that we also know how to drive a car if we're going to feel comfortable and confident behind a wheel. So we need both of those. What I then created was, to your point, the confidence map, this quadrant, these 4 boxes that look at the mix of certainty and control. I always put certainty on the x-axis, control on the y-axis. And there are 4 outcomes. Environments where we have both certainty and control. I call that the comfort zone. We feel good, feel relaxed. It makes sense that we would be at ease because we have both of those. When we have neither, I call that the stress center. We are naturally anxious anytime we lack certainty and control. We feel vulnerable, which is to me the opposite of confidence. And then we have these 2 hybrid boxes that we ignore, but in fact, we spend a lot of time in them. The lower right-hand box, I call the passenger seat, where we have certainty but no control. That's an interesting environment. If you've been on a plane, you know that it can go from feeling relaxed one moment to feeling terrified the next. If you've taught your children how to drive, that is definitely the case. The comfort zone, or the passenger seat, interestingly, that lower right-hand corner defines a maximum security prison. People in a prison have absolute certainty, but are completely powerless. So there's an authoritarian nature to that lower right-hand box. The last box is what I call the launch pad. We have control, but no certainty. It's anytime we begin something, but we don't know the outcome. Every financial decision is made in the launch pad. Whether we're borrowing money, investing money, lending money, that is an environment in the launch pad.
Grace, I don't know if you've encountered this before. So actually, first, just tell me this. Have you ever encountered this confidence map before in detail?
No, and this is so fascinating to me, Peter, especially that element of control. It was something that I had never considered before. And, as you were speaking, I was just kind of thinking back on my musician years and thinking back to things I've started and my artistic work over the years. And it's so interesting. You described that last quadrant in terms of our financial decisions where we have control, but we don't see what the outcome is going to be. And, the artistic process is very much like that, in the sense that we can control, we can create something. We don't know how it's necessarily going to be received. That outcome, that exploration is part of what a creativity is. And it was just such a fascinating sort of way of framing it. And, but then on the other side of things, I was also thinking about my performing years. And, since this is a conversation about confidence and, before coming into this conversation, I was thinking about, the days when I used to walk out on stage and perform and what that meant. And it also was kind of trusting the work you've done, the process to get there. But then once you get on stage, there are so many things that are out of your control. Meaning, like for me as a pianist, I didn't know what kind of instrument I was going to be playing on. I didn't know what kind of hall. I didn't know if that day on the way to the hall, there's a car accident. So I come running in 5 minutes before and I'm like, all over the place, but I have to play. So it's kind of that, like you said, that interesting sort of intersection and dynamic between what you can see and then also what you can control. That's fascinating. Yeah.
Peter, when you think about like from an artistic zone, walk me around can you walk us around the quadrants and just think about from like a creative process? Like what you as a writer, like when are you comfortable? When are you in the stress center? When are you in the passenger seat? When are you in the launch pad as a writer?
So I loved your analogy of the creation process. So launching a book, publishing music, any sort of creative endeavor, the first time that you are sharing it with others, you go back and forth between being in the launch pad and being in the stress center because you don't know how they're going to respond. In fact, the best advice I got from my publisher when we were getting ready to launch the book was to analogize your book to a painting and to appreciate that some people are going to look at it and go, oh my gosh, that's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Others are going to go, I don't see what's in that. That's the ugliest thing. And I just love that you should do that with anything that you're creating. You feel in the passenger seat when you are, when you're learning, but not yet doing. If I think about in the context of musicianship, you take all these classes that teach you theory, but you aren't playing. One of my big objections to how we teach music is in contrast to art. In art, we give someone a white canvas and say, draw. And that is putting them in the launch pad, giving them agency to create in an environment of uncertainty. In music, we give someone a piece of music and say, play. And that tends to be in the passenger seat because you have this authoritarian piece of paper in front of you telling you what to do. And I wish we would give young people a keyboard and say, just create noise, just make sound. But the composing process is in the launch pad. The learning process, the being told how to play it process is in the passenger seat. And to me, Grace, if you were a concert pianist, you spent a lot of time in that passenger seat. And I can't imagine the frustration.
Yes.
No, please talk about the passenger seat and just the frustration of, and just to remind you. So we're basically saying you have low control, but high certainty in that passenger seat. Do I have that right, Peter?
Yeah. And demand for high certainty, especially as a performer.
As a performer, that's so interesting because one of the difficulties, I think, in that field, in the field that I come from, classical music, is that transition between being a student and then that moment when you really become an artist. There's a very big difference between the two. So, you can really tell who's still a student because they haven't owned their art yet. It's not their voice yet. It's still the voices of others. And so the difficulty within that artistic realm is because, there's so much tradition there. There's so much, as you said, the score, you're like, you're learning all these years of training and learning and studying all of that. But then to really stand on your own, to become an artist means departing from that and getting to the point where you have the technical ability, but that's not what defines an artist, right? What defines an artist is your voice and what it is that you uniquely express. And oftentimes this is where many musicians struggle. And it shows up in a lot of different ways. They become afraid to start their artistic career, so they stay in school forever, for their master's, for their doctorate, for their postdoctorate, for their artistic diploma. They still keep staying for as long as they can, because to make that leap, you're not going to have a teacher telling you, oh, that's a good interpretation. You're not going to have a teacher telling you like, oh, the sound is good. You have the right balance, or your pedaling is right. You need to be able to figure all that stuff out on your own and to be able to express it in your own unique way. So that's very interesting. I love that. Yeah.
Yeah. My son is a jazz guitarist, and he would suggest that most musicians are compliant. They play what's written in front of them. They're very comfortable complying to the music. He said to be a successful jazz musician, it's about creating. There is no score in front of you. And so he says it's fascinating to work with musicians who are fabulous technically, but who are terrified of, we're going to give you 64 measures, you play with it. And to him, that's the joy of performing. But to others, that's terrifying.
The abject terror of what happens once you're out from behind the thing, you're on the stage, the art is being received, you're being judged.
Yeah.
Yes.
Peter, I want to take this back to you on this. One of the wonderful things about this tour, of this map that you're on here, is that it's not static. So something you explain in the book that maybe you could talk to us a little bit about is we can put a snapshot and say, you are here now. You are in the mall. You are next to Macy's, but you're not staying there. You're going to wander down that hall. You're going to wander into that music store. You're going to get a, wonderful hot pretzel along the way, whatever's going to happen. Talk to us how we move through phases of confidence.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest disservices the self-help world does is to suggest that you have to have confidence, and once you have it, you're going to have it forever.
How dare you take self-help down this path?
No, it's well-intentioned. But the reality is, real life moves us around. The analogy I use in my book is an airplane ride. I have my freshmen map their senior year of high school, the application process, the prom, they begin to see that real life takes us from one box to another. You can map the hero's journey of mythology. You can map Marvel movies. And what you see is that we go from in the comfort zone one moment to being in the stress center another. And what I think is so helpful about the framework of my book is that it suggests that there is actually order to the anxiety that we feel, that it's natural for us to feel stressed out when we feel powerless and uncertain. That's natural. And it's nothing to be afraid of, because tomorrow you're going to be in a different place. One of my favorite diagrams was one written by an emergency room doctor on a napkin. I was interviewing emergency room doctors during COVID to find out how the experience had affected them. And he said that the typical day of an emergency room doc is a line that goes back and forth violently between the stress center and the comfort zone. That their job is to get out of the stress center as quickly as they can because the next ambulance is coming in. And I love that image because it just helps to visualize why that experience and that career is so different from so many others.
Grace, when you think about fast forwarding in your career a little bit, when you think about the decision to stop doing music and figure out something else, I know you don't have the map right in front of you to think through this, but like, where was your confidence, your feeling of confidence and certainty before you decided to make the jump? Like what changed in your mind, if you can try to use some of these terms of control and certainty to think about this?
So it's interesting. Again, in leading up to this conversation, I was thinking back on my career and where confidence played a role. I think the nature of what I did, meaning interpreting works of art, right, to perform, the process of it is, for example, when I started a new piece of music, when I started to learn something new for tour, I don't know yet what I want to say with it. I don't have my interpretation yet. I'm searching, but there's no outcome. And then that's the process itself. As I work on the piece, I'm uncovering what it is. Oh, this is what I want to say with it. This is how I want to express this. This is how I uncover that. So I think as I neared the end of my career, I love, Peter, your point about how we tend to not recognize that fear and anxiety are just normal parts of being human, right? I mean, this is not something to fear, because what was so interesting about that pivot was that before I committed to the decision, there was a greater amount of fear. So there was fear in anticipation of the fear, if that makes sense. And so I was terrified of it. But then once I made the decision, like, no, this is what I'm going to do. And this is what I mean about how my artistic process helped in that. I have no idea what I'm going to do next. I literally I had done music my whole life. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know what I could do. I didn't know where my life was going to go. But that's okay. I'm going to find out. It was that type of decision. And once I made that commitment, it was fine. Like, and then actually everybody else had a much harder time accepting it than I did. But it was interesting, that the fear of the fear was more about the fear itself than actually moving through it. But it was sort of, I think, my creative past and that artistic sort of process of mine has helped me make these pivots over the years, because I'm searching. I'm coming from it from the point of searching. I am exploring, and I don't know what it's going to be yet. And that's okay, because what I have learned from a very early age is that it will come. If I trust the process, it will reveal itself.
Peter, what can you say to us about like pre-fear and pre-anxiety versus, I don't want to say actual fear and actual anxiety, but they're different, right?
They are. And I love the way you put it, Grace, that fear of the fear that's going to exist. When I've interviewed patients awaiting a cancer diagnosis, that's very much the same sensation. Even when the diagnosis is bad, cancer patients feel more confident once they know what the enemy is. And so that taking control, as you described, eliminates the fear. Now you're off the cliff. You've jumped. And I encourage people that are in that mode, that are fearing the fear. The best thing you can do is to focus, again, points you've raised, on the preparation. What can I do so that when I do make that leap, I am most likely to be successful? And this is especially the case where someone has gone from being intensely compliant to now being put in a position where they have to take control. I always emphasize that the movement from the passenger seat to the launch pad is a swap of two elements. I'm trading powerlessness for control and uncertainty for uncertainty. And that's a big gut change, particularly if you've been told that you're only good when you're compliant.
Chris, you know something about being
fascinating. This is absolutely fascinating to me. Yes, because it's so true. And so, yeah, oh, this is really interesting, Peter. So the moment I made that decision to leave music, and I walked away for many reasons, including not wanting to be compliant to the industry, wanting to have greater ownership and agency over my life. This is very, very fast. Once I did that, every subsequent pivot in my life, and I've pivoted several times in terms of my career, has been easier because I'm already in that space now where I am okay with that uncertainty because I have greater agency over my own life. So this is really interesting. My whole life is flashing before me.
No, and I think that those experiences with agency are so important, both when we succeed and when we fail. I'm a big fan of experiential learning. The classroom is only good for so much. You'll have to get out there. I can't imagine learning to ski without ever putting on the skis. We have to put people in that launchpad experience. And one of the things that concerns me is that we are raising a generation of individuals who've been largely taught that to be successful means to be compliant. And we need people who are much more comfortable in that entrepreneurial zone where I don't know what the outcome's going to be, but we're taking charge now. We'll figure it out.
Grace, I'm thinking about your community and some of the stuff. So I'm jumping you way forward into post music and into the marketing job and everything else. Maybe we'll fill in some background details on this, but you spend a lot of time these days kind of helping people with that thing of that trading of the discomfort for control and everything.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I've always said that, internal growth and that internal journey is necessary and required for the external growth to happen. And so much of the work that we do within the community is about that. It's about helping them move through fear, helping them to accept it as being just a natural part of it, and to do that. And it's so interesting that today I just wrote an article about conviction and how sort of it's not talked about enough in this kind of entrepreneurial space about this trust that, to Peter's point, that it's not about whether or not challenges are going to happen, but trusting that you have the capacity and the ability to be able to move through it when it does, and you'll figure it out as you go, right? And I think what I see, especially online, with a lot of people who perhaps give up, they try the entrepreneurial thing and then they give up, or they decide, oh, it's not for me, is oftentimes, that inability to commit to the longer term vision of things is oftentimes a reflection of their capacity to have that degree of conviction, like their level of conviction. How much can they really trust themselves? And I think, again, this tying it all the way back to my artistic roots, the reason why I was able to commit to those endless hours of practice and the work that's necessary to be able to get a piece to a certain level, to write a novel, right? To be able to do the writing and the work is because of the conviction that my voice, my music, this story was valuable and important. If I didn't believe that, there's no way I could have walked out on stage and performed a Rachmaninoff concerto if I didn't believe in that, right? So that level of conviction is necessary to then translate into this commitment towards realizing it. And so, yeah, so we talk about that a lot in our community.
Is confidence committing to conviction? Is that a variation on the definition, or pull that apart, Peter?
No, but I like the point of conviction. And one of the things I would add, Grace, is we often need people in our lives to reinforce our conviction when we lack it. I think of those moments that are so powerful where somebody believes in you when you don't. And the difference that makes over and over and over. And I truly believe that when we talk about, getting the blessing and giving people the blessing, it is reminding them in those moments that you have this. I know you have it. And I believe that on the other side of this is really powerful, wonderful stuff. But I worry today in this empathy lacking world, we don't have enough people who are seeing where people are and taking the moment to say, I believe in you. You're in the stress center now, but let me remind you of the times you've been here and have gotten out. Let me remind you of the skills that you have. Let me just know that I'm not going to abandon you on this journey.
Yeah.
I'm holding this on you for a second here, Peter. At 45, you took advice not from a parent or not from somebody who was looking down on everything in your life and career. Who gave you advice and changed things up for you when you were questioning some of your own confidence in these things and what to do next?
Oh, I think, my wife's willingness to go on this journey with me, she never doubted that we would figure it out. And, we didn't know what it was going to look like. We didn't know, and even more so, she said, you can't make a decision for a year because I know you're going to pick up a headhunter's going to call and you're going to take the next job. And I don't want you to do that. So
Tell the quick version of the story, just because I'm sure Grace doesn't know it. I'm sure some of our listeners don't.
So when I turned 45, I'm blowing out the candles on my cake, and my then 8-year-old son looks over at me and he says, Dad, you're halfway to 90. And that was a huge gut punch. and I'm looking at him and my daughter, and I'm thinking, wow, in a flash, you're going to be off to college. And I don't know that I want to spend the other half of my life, what I hope is another half of my life, doing what I'm doing. And a couple of months later, I quit my job and I didn't know what I was going to do next, but I knew I had to make a change.
I love it.
You talked about jumping into the launch pad.
I love that.
You jumped into the launch pad. With a support network of around you, part pushing you in just by idea, like, obviously children are usually trying not to deliberately cause midlife crises and things like this. But at the same time, like knowing your wife didn't look at you and you said, look up the hood for her call, Mr. Atwater.
Oh, and there were people who were looking at me like, professionally, you're making a terrible choice. You're in your peak earning years. You've got, why aren't you continuing to do this? And why would you ever choose to start all over in something completely different?
Grace, if you had met Peter at 45, 90, staring him down the barrel of his age, and he came into your community and said, my wife told me I have to take a year off. I have to figure out what else to do that's not this Wall Street financial services thing. How would you receive him into the community if that's where he came into you? Because you have people like this in your community.
I'd be like, come on in. Come on in. We're all of us. It doesn't matter what you've achieved or where you're at. We're all figuring it out. That's what life is. And come on in. Let's figure it out together. Let's see where it takes us. There's a lot of we talk a lot about alignment and finding things that feel right to who we are. And of course, that's why change is. It's so important to become comfortable with the discomfort of change because of that, right? Because we are not static. I mean, to Peter's point, I think earlier in the conversation that we evolve and we change. We go between these different quadrants as we're moving through life. And I think that always, for me, I always encourage people to try to remain as connected to themselves as much as possible so that you can see that as you start to evolve, is what you're doing still in alignment with who you are? Or is there something that needs to be adjusted here or adjusted there? And I'm very, very big on that idea. So I love that.
And it's really interesting too, because in the communal aspect, like if somebody didn't have a spouse or has a limited social network or friend group to help them with this, there's a huge difference between getting like dumped in that stress center
Mm.
and even finding anybody in the world, the empathy point you were making earlier, Peter, like anybody in the world to just help pull you from stress center to launch pad.
Yeah, and I love your point, Grace, about being comfortable with the discomfort. Because if you asked me what are the important traits to be resilient, at the top of that list is being comfortable with discomfort. If I think, people who are resilient are as comfortable outside the comfort zone as they are inside. And they see those other boxes as just part of life and are not debilitated when things happen. It's like, okay, I'm here for now.
It's amazing to think about that.
First
The
Rachmaninoff
discomfort.
piece
So practicing
ever.
this, and maybe this goes back to just like practicing a piece of music, like talk about Rachmaninoff for a second, just because who doesn't want to talk about Rachmaninoff, really? How hard is Rachmaninoff to play, like objectively, when you're in the world of piano? And then what do you do to get comfortable with that?
So I remember the first Rachmaninoff piece I learned. I must have been 8 or 9 at the time. It was Rachmaninoff's C-sharp minor prelude. And for those of you who may not know, Rachmaninoff was notorious for these huge chords in his works because he had massive hands himself. I am 5'1", an Asian girl. I don't have the biggest hands ever. And I remember looking at this piece and being so intimidated by it, these huge chords. And when I started learning it, I was convinced I would never be able to play it. It was so difficult. And I had to learn to figure out ways to be able to be more flexible in my technique in order to be able to play those chords in the ways that were necessary. Um, it's interesting because that sort of discomfort, it never goes away. Like even for the rest of my artistic career, even if I played many more Rachmaninoff works and Chopin works, and anytime I started a new piece of music, learning a new piece of music, of course, it's always uncomfortable in the beginning. Always, you're going to think, "Oh my gosh, this section in the middle, I'm not going to be able to get through this. I have to figure out how to get through it." And then you start working through it. So one of the things that I have done because of that, in my own personal life, I don't know if I've ever shared this with you, Matt, but since I left music, um, I am very conscious of keeping that muscle of change active. And so what I do is I always do one new thing every week. And so by the end of each year, I have done 52 new things. And it doesn't have to be anything massive. Like it doesn't have to be, jumping out of an airplane or skydiving or anything like that. It can be as simple as taking a different route home from work one day, trying a new food that you've never tried before, listening to a different genre of music, reading a different genre of book, something that always keeps me in a place where I don't lose or I get to the point where I'm so hardened that I can't adjust to the discomfort, And so that's something I consciously do every week.
How long have you been doing this?
Years now.
Sure.
Years and years and years. Years now. So I am very cautious of that. Every week I'm like, okay, what am I going to try today or this week? Or if I realize that I've hit Friday and I haven't done anything sort of different, I'll be like, okay, you haven't done this yet, so I'm going to wear this color today, or I'm going to try something like this, or read something new. And I'm very aware of it. Yeah.
Peter, what can you say about that? What she just said about like having to actually change and expand on her techniques, which is basically to grow. So the idea of
Yeah.
moving around this map as a growth mechanism.
Yeah. So most people, whether it's learning a piece of music or learning a new language, the goal is fluency, that they want it to be easy. I love the concept of fluence. Uh, Psychologists use it. I think when I think about being confident in something, I measure it in terms of its fluidity, because to be confident, I'm using system one thinking. I have cognitive ease. Of course, I am fluent in that, and we aspire to that. And in fact, we culturally we encourage people, become fluent in French, become fluent in this or that. And I would imagine that fluency is a term you may hear in a lot of your practice as a musician, that you know the piece when you're fluent in whoever that is. And yet there is the pitfall of that comfort, because once you are fluent, you don't aspire to have those awkward moments again, to, you forget the words, you forget the notes, you forget, and suddenly you feel flawed, when in fact you're now moving around the map. And I love the idea of staying non-fluent. It's sort of the anti-fragile of life, be non-fluent, and be okay with that. You talk about choosing to be outside of your comfort zone deliberately. And it's that mindset of, okay, I've mastered a lot of things. What can I now do that puts me in a position where I am non-fluent, where I have to think about it, have to learn and figure it out? I love it.
I just loved what you said about fluency just now, Peter. In music, one of the traps that especially virtuosic uh, musicians, meaning technique comes easily to them, right? One of the traps that they can easily fall into is to go on what we call autopilot, right? Where they show up on stage and they just play it because it's so fluid, but they're not there. They're not, the experience is not there because because they're just going. And I also, once I mastered or got really owned a work, and let's say I'm on tour, so I'm performing it, every 3 days, time and time and time again, I had to always have that level of intentionality and self-awareness to make sure I also didn't fall into the trap of just going on autopilot. And for me, I would use the audience as my way of kind of staying in the moment and it being aware of them. And are they following? What if I try phrasing it a little bit different this time? And are they staying with me? But it's that willingness, like you said, to kind of put ourselves into that type of situation. I love that. Oh.
And it's hard. My wife was a professional actress, and she, to your point, you've done the show over and over and over. It becomes so fluent that you're not paying any attention to what's really happening. You're delivering their lines, they're delivering, and so to be deliberate is a step that is necessary. And I think this is something in so much of the decisions that we make in life, that we become fluent in that choice, that we never stop to be deliberate. And it's hard to suddenly be deliberate.
This step to be deliberate. And maybe Grace, like, I wonder if you can reconcile this for me, because I'm also thinking about beyond asking for the audience feedback, I want to come back to that, I think, too. Like these two layers, there's like the immediate keep me uncomfortable layer of trying the one new thing a week. But then there's like a longer term layer. So it's like you're using this one thing for like the deliberate remind yourself how to be uncomfortable. Is it, I don't want to call it a coping mechanism. Is it almost like a coping mechanism to help you with the way bigger projects in life you're dealing with?
That's so interesting. I think one of the things I've noticed just in my own life, and again, fear, I'm going through a major change right now in my life as well. So I'm dealing with a lot of discomfort around like how I perceive myself, how I understand myself, what do I want to do? And it's, I think what it does, or what I've learned over the years is that I'm faster at recognizing when fear rears its head. So when things start to happen that it's out of alignment, I'm quicker to recognize, oh, yeah, you're afraid here. There's a fear popping up here. And then because I'm faster at recognizing it, and I've had enough experiences of moving through it, that I know for myself, like sort of my process of being able to move through it. So then that process also becomes faster, right? Than it was, for example, when I was, 20 years old. I'm much quicker at identifying it. Okay, we got to start moving through. So in that sense, I don't know if that answers your question, man, but in that sense, maybe, recognizing discomfort and identifying it, and its place in my life and why it's popping up, does help me maybe in a more macro way in that sense. It never goes away. It's faster though, my ability to handle it. Yeah.
Peter, what do you think about like the speed of recognition or the speed of being able to process this thing? Maybe it's like where you are and how to move out of it.
But I think it's also recognizing that those feelings, one, are natural, that they are accompanied by stories that are often self-limiting. So I know that if I'm in the stress center, if anybody's in the stress center, the stories they are going to be telling themselves are mean. They're nasty. You're not enough. One of my favorite charts in my book is Google searches for the words, am I fat? Am I ugly? Am I stupid? They peak every night along with our searches for anxiety. So what that tells me is that when we are anxious, we are the nastiest people to ourselves. And if you can just hear your story, you can go, oh, I'm telling me this story because I'm in the stress center. I know when I leave the stress center, my story is going to change. So I need to just stop listening to that voice because it's a function of my location, not reality.
Do you feel like that, Grace? Do you feel like it's the speed of recognizing the story script almost in each of these places when you're describing
yes.
it?
And I think each time I move through the fear, because every time I've done that, I've understood myself better, which means that I understand the scripts I have a tendency to tell myself. And it's about recognizing that. So when that narrative pops up, I'm like, oh, that the story is popping up again. Okay, well, and then that's where the agency comes in, right? Like, okay, how are you going to address it? You know that this is just a limiting sort of belief. The amount of times I have self-sabotaged myself over the years is quite spectacular. But when you recognize that, and then there's this kind of acceptance. Again, to Peter's point about how when we're able to sort of get to the point where we can just accept fear and as just part of who we are, accept that we've told these stories to ourselves, but they don't define us. To Peter's point, we're in a certain place, we're in a certain quadrant. That general overall self-acceptance, I think, is part of what helps me to be able to recognize it quicker and be able to move it faster. Yeah.
I want to go straight to the stress center for a minute here, because Peter, you have one of my favorite things from the book was you have a few F's that belong with the stories we tell ourselves in the stress center. Let's earn the explicit language sticker if we have to on this one, but can you explain those F's and
Sure.
why they show up in the stress center? Because I think this is profoundly useful.
So again, the opposite of being confident is feeling vulnerable. And vulnerability to me is a really useful way of understanding how we act in the stress center. When we are intensely vulnerable, we've spent a lot of time talking about fight and flight, right? I'm going to either run away from it, what I'm afraid of, or I'm going to fight it. They're interesting, but they're not entirely accurate. They're also hard. If I'm going to fight, I better feel strong, which if I'm in the stress center, I tend not to feel strong. And if I'm going to flee, I have to have the ability to flee. So there are other things that we do. So fight, flight, we freeze often. We're just paralyzed by the fear. The one that doesn't get enough attention is that we follow. We are highly susceptible to the voices of others in that space. And in fact, following is our easiest response. I don't need skills. I don't need money. I don't need anything other than get in line behind this person.
The scripts of others. Profound truth, and other people stepping in and saying, no, climb this ladder, do this thing.
Yeah. And so we need to be really careful about who we're following. Do they have our best interest in mind? And most, particularly groups, tend to follow someone from the stress center into the passenger seat who never wants us to get back to the comfort zone, who would love nothing more than for us to be disempowered forever. It's the rise of the authoritarian leader. But the last one, so you got fight, flight, freeze, follow, and the last one is fuck it. So the nihilistic response of I'm out, but I'm not out. And that fuck it response is either self-sabotage, to your point, Grace, or I'm just going to sabotage others. I'm going to have fun at their expense. And we see that a lot in corporate mergers where people stay, but sabotage left and right. But the fuck it response is a real one. And I don't think we pay attention. And fuck it often combines. If I think of acts of terrorism, they are the fight and fuck it response embedded in one act. And so if you were to look at the relationship between confidence and terrorism, it's highly predictable. When confidence is very low, we should expect terrorist activity.
Yeah, when confidence is low and stress is in a place of very low certainty, right? Like that's that mishmash. Grace, I'm just confused. Like, how do those strike you? Do any of those jump out at you as just like, oh crap, I see this?
It's really interesting. I actually have a question for Peter, because you described that area as one of vulnerability. And so my question to you, because I am someone who very much values authenticity, it's an idea, a topic I talk a lot about, which requires vulnerability in the sense of, sharing the fact that I've gone through shit and being honest about all of that stuff. How does vulnerability in that sort of a framing fit within confidence? I think this might be a very interesting thing to.
So I love your distinction between authenticity and vulnerability, because authenticity is a choice. I choose to disclose. I'm choosing, and we often say, and I particularly in the self-help world, there's a lot of discussion about choosing to be vulnerable. I disagree with that. I think vulnerability is involuntary. We don't choose to feel powerless. We don't choose to be out of control. And so I think choosing to be authentic and showing your belly, that's not vulnerability as much as it is putting yourself in the launch pad where you have agency. And you can stop. You can stop in a moment to say, I've shared too much. I'm done. A vulnerable moment You can't choose not to be in the emergency room. You can't choose not to be mugged. You can't choose not to be, a victim of abuse. That vulnerability is imposed. And I think the distinction again between authenticity and vulnerability is agency. I can choose to be authentic. I cannot choose, because I would never choose to be vulnerable.
This is fascinating
I
because
love this so much. Yeah.
we're not going to, there's no surprise caller. Brene Brown shows up and like schools us all on something here, but I think she would agree with this because like,
I have a lot of time for Brene Brown.
of
I'm
course,
not being critical of, I just think the word choice of vulnerability isn't precise. I love, you're choosing to be authentic. You are choosing these moments, but my head explodes when I hear executives saying, I'm choosing an experience of being vulnerable. It's like, that's a game you get to play. But as CEO, you can choose to stop that game at any point.
especially from the CEO seat. Go ahead. Grace.
I was just going to say, Matt, do you know, because this just reminded me, do you know the etymology of the word vulnerable, like where it comes from?
So
Actually,
I'm looking it up
Peter's-
because I know
yeah.
the authentic one. So yeah, I was
Yes,
curious. Did you look
it's
it up too?
years ago, but it just what Peter said just reminded me of it because he's right. The root of it is vulnus. It's wound. The root meaning of the word that it comes from in Latin is wound. So we don't choose. You're right. There's no agency in that. We're in a situation in which we're powerless. We're wounded, right? Literally. And then authenticity as this empowered, sort of agency that we have that we choose to do it. I love that definition so much. Oh, Peter, I'm going to be using that in my community moving forward. That was fantastic.
Yeah, it's remarkable. So with authentic, you have self and genuine. You have choice embedded in the meaning of the word. And I was looking up vulnerable at the same time. So thank you for beating me to it because it means to be wounded, which to your point, Peter, you have no control over that.
No.
I want to follow it up with
I didn't know the etymology as I've been thinking about this for a long time, but I love, Grace, that you've now added that because that conveys the involuntary nature of this.
Yeah. When you think about it from a leader's perspective, and I'm thinking about like the leader who goes out and reads Brene Brown and buys his copy of Dare to Lead and is out there saying, I am being vulnerable. I want you, underling, teller in my bank that I'm the CEO of to be more vulnerable and bring that to work. The mismatch that goes on there, like, what's a good way to do that? Say the bad way to do it first, and maybe tell us what a good way to do that is for a leader. And probably not use the word vulnerable, but yeah.
I don't think there is a good way for a leader to do that. I really don't. I think that when leaders are interacting with those at the bottom of the hierarchy, it's important to express empathy and to express appreciation and value, and the importance of community. But it just comes across as so trite to be the vulnerable leader, particularly today in an environment where people already feel powerless and uncertain. I just can't imagine a more tone deaf message than a CEO, proclaiming his or her vulnerability. Okay, they don't know vulnerability today.
Grace, what about you? If the leader top down, what would you add to Peter's definition or explanation there?
I think it ties back into something that we were speaking about, or Peter was speaking about earlier in the conversation. For me, the critical importance of seeing and hearing people, but to really see them, and to see who they are. Of course, it ties into empathy. It ties into, active listening, all these ways of connecting on a deeply human level is, I think, so critical, because when you really see people, whether it's in your community, the people that you lead, everything changes. You wouldn't make these kind of tone deaf statements. You wouldn't be creating disconnect. It would instead be encouraging that level of mutual understanding, being able to support them in the right ways because everyone is different, really being able to recognize that, um, to be seen for who you are. And this again, Matt, I think you and I have spoken about this previously, but uh, you know, I grew up not being seen for who I was. I was seen for the achievements and all the external trappings of this, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and it took me a very long time to understand, well, if I want to be seen, what does that mean? Right. And then translating that into how can I see others for who they are, because I know how important that is.
And as a leader, Peter, you're trying to help them be seen, and you want to be aware of where they likely are, what script they're telling themselves, where in that confidence map they're sitting, right? One of the best things we can do for another person.
Yeah, one of the most insightful and inspiring conversations I've had was with a woman who managed a meat processing plant. So you can imagine thousands of minimum wage workers. And she had a conversation with folks on her team, asking them where they felt most powerless and uncertain in their jobs. So she wanted to know, how did they feel vulnerable? And by framing it in terms of powerless and uncertain, it was not a judgment call. There's no sense of good, bad, right, wrong. It's just, how do you feel powerless in your job? And what she discovered was their greatest sources of vulnerability related to little things outside of the work that cascaded into impacting work. And she told me this story about taillights, because the police would wait and catch people almost deliberately who had a taillight out as they're getting ready to, turn into the parking lot at work. And that taillight ticket then creates a financial problem, then creates a time problem, which creates a childcare problem, which creates a work problem. And her comment was to her players was sort of, so if we gave you time to deal with the taillight, all of this would change. And they were like, yeah. And so she experimented. She's like, yeah, okay, I'm going to schedule time for you to be able to deal with this stuff. And turnover dropped dramatically. And they started to look at housing issues and employees who didn't know their rights as a tenant. And so by addressing the vulnerability that employees have in life, it dramatically changed performance on the job. There was a great article in the Wall Street Journal recently on childcare, corporate sponsored childcare, and what a huge impact that has. And so I wish leaders would think more holistically about the vulnerability of their employees, because there are a lot of things you can do that cost you nothing, but have immense return on investment in terms of the workforce.
It's staggering when you start to add up the things, having spent a lot of time designing wellness programs for corporations and small businesses. When you start adding up all the things that you think are, that they're not even on the radar of leadership in so many cases.
No.
And they're very minor things that just improving retention alone, like what you said, not having to go out and hire the next person who wants to clean the meat grinder is one of those things that if I could just keep that person here and knows what they're doing in a kind way, they want the job in a kind way. Grace, any other thoughts on that? Just from like the top down, like Grace with the leadership hat on.
That's really interesting, because it's, to me, Peter's story is an example really of active listening, right? And listening, and I make the difference between hearing and listening, because I think many of us fall into the hearing trap, which I think is very passive. you can hear a lot of things. You can hear the motorcycle going by on the street. You can hear, the car in the background. You can hear a lot of things without really taking that in. Listening is active. It requires active energy. It requires really paying attention to what they're saying. For me, I always say, what are they saying behind the words, right? Not just the words they say. What is it behind it that that- that's trying to come through that you need to kind of pay attention to, and that requires, yeah, difference between listening and hearing.
And I love that because it ties back to a point you've made before, which is it's deliberate, which means that good listening happens in the launch pad, not the comfort zone.
I want to summarize this. I want to give us some notes here. I have plenty from this conversation. You guys delivered, to say the least here. We started off, and I think if nothing else, just understanding that confidence breaks down into these two variables of certainty and control. And you can find Peter's work. You'll tell him where to find you in a minute here, Peter. But if you just remember that certainty, control, two separate things, four combinations. We talked about, Grace, the artistic process in control, and how it's received becomes the most important thing. Even when you don't know what you're doing, you're making this thing and you're shipping it out into the world. We talked about the student to artist transition inside of that too, and how the student hasn't owned their art yet. It's a really important thing to just remember when you're working on something. You got to earn that art by doing it over time. Peter, you pointed out self-help isn't always helpful. Maybe it's selfish too. Real life takes us on a journey. Certainty and control is dynamic. I think that too. Keep bringing this up over and over again, how dynamic certainty and control are. They're never static. Grace, this is a whole other episode, the self-reflection versus how others have received it. Your identity as a person has to become in how the who that is you finds out. We talked about how growth requires we reject fear and comfort. We have to reject this ability to have control, embrace no control. We talked a lot about conviction and what that word means. Peter, you brought up that we need people in our lives to reinforce conviction when we lack it, whether we're going out and finding that in a community or from a spouse or getting good advice from our kids. Getting comfortable with the discomfort of change, the comfort of practice. Peter, Grace, you told us about your amazing story about doing one new thing a week. Peter, you brought in the word resilience and getting the most resilient people being most comfortable outside of the things of the comfort zone, of the things where they are inside. Grace, you told us the story about Rachmaninoff and learning this, which Peter, you echoed with learning a new thing. The goal is fluency because people want easy, but confidence, that fluency that's worth aspiring to, is so friggin' rarely easy. It's hard to learn another language. I have a niece who's French. Can I speak French? No, not remotely. But will I continue to try and not be fluent? Probably. Her English is getting very good. We talked about staying non-fluent, the power of that, I think I'm going to be thinking about this at 3:00 in the morning for weeks to come. The traps of virtuosity. Grace, I love this lesson where fluency works, but you can't go on autopilot. I wrote down that autopilot is probably the antithesis of the art. Fascinating that you have to use the audience. You need feedback. And sometimes you actually have to break yourself out of fluency, out of autopilot, to put yourself in that moment where you're on the stage and you're looking for that feedback. Peter, we talked about the stories of each place, the scripts in each of those boxes, how they're self-limiting, or they can be self-limiting. But Grace, you countered with like how fast you can see those scripts. And if you keep training, you can keep seeing them faster. And then I wrote down to myself, it's almost like you have to fast forward back to agency. You have to fast forward back to your ability to be able to like take over that script. And then in the end of this conversation, which I think we cracked the Brené Brown code here, the opposite of confidence is vulnerability. We broke down how authenticity, the etymology of the word, is basically yourself, genuine, your ability to have choice, whereas vulnerability is the lack of it. It's that non-choice. It's that exposure to wound or be wounded is to be vulnerable. We related that back to leadership, and leaders, you got to see how your people are actually feeling, what it means for them to be them. And then Grace, you followed it up with saying hearing is not really listening. And if you're a leader, that becomes one of the most important things you can do. Remember that just because you say you heard it, you listen to them, doesn't mean you really heard it. You can't control how the message is received. You only control what you can do, what you can practice. So confidence then becomes your awareness of certainty and control. And that's your power. That's your grace. That's your map for this whole thing. Grace, please tell the people where they can find you.
First of all, Matt, you have the most extraordinary talent. With your summaries are amazing. All right. So everyone, you can find me at kizunanyc.com or kizunanyc on Twitter, which is really where I spend most of my time on socials nowadays.
Peter, where can the good people find you?
So they can find me on the bookstore at The Confidence Map, which is my book available on Amazon. They can find me on Twitter, Peter_Atwater. And I write other things on LinkedIn. Twitter tends to be financial. LinkedIn tends to be much more really broad topics involving confidence.
I want to thank you both so much for joining me today. You're watching Just Press Record on the Cultish Creative YouTube channel. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks for joining us. Like, comment, and hey, subscribe below to Cultish Creative on YouTube if you haven't already. As the good compliance people want me to remind you, Matt Ziegler, that's me, is a managing director at Sunpoint Investments. The opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Sunpoint Investments. No information on this podcast should be construed as investment advice. Securities discussed in the podcast may be holdings of clients of Sunpoint Investments. I hope you've been entertained. I hope you found this useful. I hope you talk to a professional before you try any of this stuff at home. And most of all, I hope you've subscribed. Be nice to each other out there. And don't forget, head over to cultishcreative.com and let's make curiosity a habit together. And I'm out.